尊13枚安城に記号舎利没小仏知恵人人無量語知恵門難下難入一切小門百死仏小風の知小医者が敵は本能寺にあり。明智だ。
日に及ばず蘭丸。
Hello everybody, I'm Andrew, and what you just saw was a reenactment of the assassination of Oda Nobunaga. You might be thinking to yourself, who the hell is Oda Nobunaga, and what the hell did I just watch? Well, that's what I'm going to explain to you throughout the duration of this video. Well, the basics are, in 1582, Akechi Mitsuhide betrayed his master, Oda Nobunaga. To this day, nobody knows why he did it. That's why it's one of the greatest mysteries of Japanese history. This event is so legendary that it's even been ingrained into the popular culture. For example, if you watch any Japanese TV show or movie, you'll find references to Akechi Mitsuhide's betrayal, in the same way that in Western media you will find references to Julius Caesar's assassination and the Ides of March. But this event is so legendary that it's even permeated into the public consciousness in that there are lots of popular kind of superstitions surrounding it. For example, last year when I was visiting Mount Koya in Wakayama Prefecture, I stumbled across the grave of Akechi Mitsuhide. And, it's just a normal grave, so it's nothing that exciting. But what was kind of interesting is it had this massive crack that ran through the middle of it. The local monk, he came over to me and he was just like, hey, it doesn't matter how many times that we fix this crack, it always comes back. He said it's because the ghost of Akechi Mitsuhide can't rest. The way history is remembered him as this murderous, kind of traitorous villain. I personally think it's time that we let Mitsuhide rest. Now let's explore why Akechi Mitsuhide betrayed Oda Nobunaga. To understand why Nobunaga was killed, we have to begin with who Nobunaga was. So Nobunaga was a man of incredible significance who would leave a legacy shaping modern Japanese society. Nobunaga lived in what was called the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. In the Warring States period, Japan was split into these tiny little countries ruled by individual warlords who would constantly beat each other's necks, hungry for each other's, land, their resources, their power. Basically, Japan was in a constant state of bloody warfare. And it wasn't until Nobunaga arrived on the scene he began to pacify this warfare by unifying it under his rule. But unfortunately, Nobunaga wasn't able to complete the unification process. He was killed in 1582 by Akechi Mitsuhide. This created this power vacuum that could only be filled by the second unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi finished Nobunaga's unification process and basically ended war in Japan, but he didn't leave any successors. So when he died, Japan regressed into another civil war. This second power vacuum was only filled by Tokugawa Ieyasu, the third unifier. Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated his power, actually left heirs, and created the Edo period. The Edo period ushered in 200 years of peace. And it is this era of rapid change from Oda Nobunaga to Tokugawa Ieyasu that created the foundations of modern Japanese society. The longest lasting impacts of this period were the formation of castle towns and the restructuring of the tax system. So from the 16th century onwards, towns would increasingly become centered around castles. So Nobunaga was the first person to have really built a castle that was both a means of defense and a place of residence. He personally planned the entire town around Azuchi Castle. And other warlords, they looked to Nobunaga and they're like, hey, that's pretty cool. And they decided to do their own thing. Gradually, these towns centered around castles became urbanized and grew into the modern-day cities of Japan. For example, if we look at Tokyo, it was born out of Edo Castle. Secondly, Nobunaga implemented a nationwide land survey which sought to evaluate the quality of land. The more fertile the land, the more rice it produced, and hence the more tax you had to pay. This system continued way into the 20th century. For example, if we look at Japan's colonization of Korea in 1910, they also conducted this wide-scale land survey and taxed people according to the fertility of their land. So it's clear that Nobunaga had, left this kind of important legacy, but this leads us to our next question. How did Nobunaga achieve this legacy? So in 1534, Nobunaga was born in Owari province, modern-day Nagoya, to this relatively minor warlord. After his father's death, he split his land amongst Nobunaga and his brothers. So at this time, Nobunaga's land is literally worth nothing. It's just some tiny slither of land. To really kind of gain any sort of meaningful power, he went and wiped his brothers off the face of the earth and took their land and resources. But even after doing this, it really wasn't until the Battle of Okehazama that Nobunaga really made a name for himself. So in the year 1560, Imagawa Yoshimoto, a neighbouring major warlord to Nobunaga, decided to march on Kyoto, which was then the capital of Japan. So to get to Kyoto, Imagawa Yoshimoto had to march through Owari province, Nobunaga's territory. And as he did that, he decided to camp his army of 40,000 men near Okehazama village. So when Nobunaga kind of caught wind of this, he decided to send his entire force of 2,000 men to Okehazama village to engage the Imagawa forces. So, it literally should have been impossible for a force of 2,000 to have overcome 40,000, but somehow Nobunaga did it. So at the time of attack, it started to pour down with rain. So as Nobunaga marched towards Imagawa's forces, it totally masked the sound of the march. So instead of trying to, conduct this war, they went around slashing heads and killing everyone. They went straight for Imagawa, the commander of the army. So as they were going through some of the different tents and killing some of the soldiers, Imagawa Yoshimoto, he just thought it was, his men getting a bit drunk and, having a bit of a party, but when they burst into his tent and cut his head off, he was very surprised. And, this battle of Okehazama, it lasted a matter of minutes. After taking his head, that was the end of the battle, and it shot Nobunaga to fame. He was known as the man who defeated a force of 40,000 with 2,000. It wasn't long before an exiled shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, he decided to come to Nobunaga and ask for his help to reclaim his throne back in Kyoto. This gave Nobunaga an excuse to march on Kyoto and take the capital for himself. So after he implanted Ashikaga Yoshiaki onto his throne, he became his political puppet and he was able to manipulate the court from the shadows, all whilst kind of expanding his military power across Japan. The second most important battle fought by Nobunaga was the Battle of Nagashino against Takeda Katsuyori. So in the 16th century, concurrent with the political disorder of the Warring States period, there were also Jesuits who were coming in from Portugal and bringing with them guns and Christianity. So the kind of gun they brought with them was called an arquebus matchlock rifle. So soon after the introduction of the arquebus, it became a cornerstone of samurai warfare. So despite, the introduction of the gun, it kind of never replaced the sword because the arquebus was not 100% effective. For example, on a rainy day, the gun pad would get wet and the arquebus would be entirely useless. But what it did kind of revolutionize was the fact that, it took a matter of years upon years to master the art of the sword, but it took a matter of days to master the gun. So warlords were able to draft peasants who didn't traditionally appear on the battlefield, have them trained in the art of the gun, and then wreak havoc across enemy lines, which is exactly what Nobunaga did at the Battle of Nagashino. Although the gun was used before the Battle of Nagashino, it was Nobunaga's tactics here that really put into motion just how destructive it could be. So what Nobunaga did is he took 3,000 peasant soldiers armed with these arquebuses, had them lined up in rows of 1,000. So there's 3 rows of 1,000. So the first line, they would fire off a volley, and then as they reloaded, the next line would come forth and then fire off another volley. In this way, Nobunaga was able to overcome the long reload times of the arquebus matchlock rifles and create a continuous round of fire. In this way, he was able to absolutely just decimate Takeda Katsuyori's cavalry charge, and he seized the victory in absolutely just revolutionized warfare. Arguably, Nobunaga would have not been able to reach such heights if it weren't for the arquebus. By 1582, Nobunaga had vanquished all of his major enemies. In 1580, he concluded a 10-year siege against the warrior monks of Ishiyama Honganji in modern-day Osaka, and in April of that year, he defeated the Takeda clan and managed to conclude this war that lasted 2 generations. The only remaining threat to his regime was the Mori clan in the west, whom he was already engaged in what looked to be a conclusive battle against. Here is where the conspiracy begins, and the line between legend and reality becomes blurred. So our story begins on that fateful day in 1582, known as the Honnōji incident. Nobunaga caught winds that the leader of the Mori clan would be taking the battlefield himself. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of Nobunaga's best commanders, was already engaged in a war against him. So to send aid, Nobunaga ordered Akechi Mitsuhide to go and help Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Nobunaga had designs to take the battlefield himself, but before going there, he would first stop by Kyoto and lodge at his favourite temple, Honnōji. So that night, Akechi Mitsuhide, he roused his men, woke them up, and had them start marching. He didn't tell them where they were going, what they were doing. They just marched. So they reached this fork in the road. The western fork would lead them to the Mori clan, where he was instructed to go, and the eastern fork would lead them to Kyoto. Akechi Mitsuhide, he told his army, hey, Nobunaga needs to inspect our army, so we're going to stop by Kyoto first. It has been kind of a bit sus about this whole thing, but, they followed him, and that morning, they arrived in Kyoto. They surrounded the Honnōji Temple. Akechi Mitsuhide ordered them to open fire, and they did so. His men knew full well what they were doing. Nobunaga always stayed at Honnōji Temple. So Nobunaga was basically stuffed. It was just him and a handful of men. There's no way that he could defend himself against an entire army. So what he did is he had one of his men set the temple alight, and he committed seppuku. He ordered his favourite page, Ranmaru, to cut off his head after doing the seppuku process to make it painless, but then his dead body withered away with the ashes of the Honnōji Temple, becoming one with the earth. So this leads us to our next question. Why did Akechi Mitsuhide betray Oda Nobunaga? The dominant narrative is that Mitsuhide did it out of revenge. Throughout the literature, there are numerous instances of Nobunaga physically and verbally abusing Mitsuhide. In one instance, Nobunaga allegedly had a hand in killing Mitsuhide's mother. The story goes that while Nobunaga was sieging a castle, they did a bit of a hostage exchange. So the other side, they sent over their hostage, and Nobunaga's side sent their hostage, which was Mitsuhide's mother. For some reason or another, Nobunaga decided to kill the hostage they received, which forced the other side in retaliation to kill, their hostage, which was Mitsuhide's mother. So this, event would have certainly sparked some sort of animosity between Nobunaga and Mitsuhide, if it actually happened. So this story is a work of fiction that can be traced back to an 18th century kabuki play. There is absolutely no mention of this in our most reliable source for the period, Oda Gyuichi. The other major event that historians traditionally point to is one that happened just before Mitsuhide took arms against Nobunaga. To help celebrate Nobunaga's triumph over his greatest foes in 1582, Tokugawa Ieyasu invited Nobunaga out on this decadent road trip. Their trip began at Mount Fuji and ended at Azuchi in modern-day Shiga Prefecture. At each day along the trip, they would stop at an elaborate tea house built by Tokugawa and his men. Nobunaga was a major patron of the tea ceremony, was impressed, not to say the least. So to repay Tokugawa for this favour, he invited him over for dinner at his castle in Azuchi. So Nobunaga tasked Mitsuhide with putting together the menu. So Mitsuhide went out and he sourced the best food and plates that money could buy. When Nobunaga got around to inspecting Mitsuhide's work, he was absolutely appalled. He declared it unfit for human consumption. He smashed up the plates, he threw the food onto the floor, then kicked it into the garden, all whilst verbally abusing Mitsuhide. Historians see this as the final nail in the coffin after a long string of abuse that set off Mitsuhide. The only thing that would sate Mitsuhide's bloodlust was the head of Nobunaga. However, if you think about it, the whole ordeal's absolutely ridiculous. After the lavish treatment that Nobunaga received from Tokugawa, it's only natural that he would want to repay him with something of equal extravagance. It's not an act of injustice, nor is it worth killing someone over. Mitsuhide's work simply wasn't up to scratch.
It's rubber! Plastic, dried shit!
And heck, Mitsuhide's not even the only person that Nobunaga abused. He famously called Hideyoshi a monkey because of his shriveled up and bald appearance. If everyone that Nobunaga abused all of a sudden wanted revenge, he would have a whole armada rising up against him. If anything, there were probably genuinely very few people who actually hated Nobunaga. The Warring States period was an age of bloody warfare. Under this backdrop, Nobunaga's actions hardly even warrant any attention. Although unknown to the people of feudal Japan, Machiavelli's words rang true. It's better to be feared than to be loved. And the samurai warlord set out to be kind to all of his neighbours, he would very quickly find himself dead and stripped of all of his possessions. But if he was feared, but not hated, like Nobunaga was, then people would be more likely to obey your orders and think twice about attacking your land. The most recent theory to come about is the Shikoku theory. In 2013, some archaeologists found a letter dated back to 1582, the year of Nobunaga's death. The letter was written by Motochika Chosokabe, one of the major warlords on the island of Shikoku. The letter was addressed to Saito Toshimitsu, a vassal of Akechi Mitsuhide. The Saito family was linked to the Chosokabe clan by marriage and was trying to conduct a peace deal behind the scenes. In the letter, Chosokabe announces his intention to surrender his land and give it up to Nobunaga. Despite this, Nobunaga still had designs and intended to take Shikoku by force. The theory goes that Akechi Mitsuhide was pissed off on behalf of his vassal. He'd spent a very long time trying to organise this peace deal, only for it to go up in smoke, and hence Mitsuhide would go on to kill Nobunaga. This theory is straight up ridiculous. First of all, this was an unofficial peace deal. The letter was addressed to a retainer of Mitsuhide. A retainer of a commander is quite low on the list of authority. If it was mediated through Nobunaga, it would have given the whole ordeal some semblance of legitimacy. Secondly, what reason would Mitsuhide have to take revenge on behalf of his subordinate? If anything, it would have made more sense if it was Saito himself exacting revenge against Nobunaga. But even then, in the world of war, alliances were broken. Being stabbed in the back by someone who you thought was your ally was certainly not unusual. If we look at Nobunaga's career, literally every junction his so-called allies stabbed him in the back and betrayed him. I think we can cross the idea of revenge off the list of possibilities. I think the real reason that Mitsuhide did it was born out of ambition. According to Oze Hoan, one of the biographers of Nobunaga, a few days before Mitsuhide marched on Kyoto, he held a poetry party at Mount Atago. Mitsuhide opened the session by giving the following poem. Toki wa ima, ame ga shita shiru, satsuki kana.
みなかめまする庭の夏山
花をつる池の流れをせき止めて
On the surface, it looks like a regular poem, but if we look deeper into it, it becomes quite apparent that it wasn't. The word toki means time, but it could also refer to the Akechi clan. The word ame could be spelled with the same character as Japan. And the next part of the poem could be interpreted to mean to seize control. So if Oze Hoan's interpretation is to be believed, then the poem actually meant Akechi Mitsuhide will take control of Japan, a bold declaration of Mitsuhide's intentions to kill Nobunaga. In addition to the poem being cloaked by a hidden meaning, the poetry session itself was also highly symbolic. The type of poetry that Mitsuhide engaged within was called Renga-linked poetry. In Renga, someone would begin with a short poem. This would then be followed by someone else who would continue the poem. This would be done until 100 verses had been constructed. Supposedly, Renga had the power to win over favour with the gods, granting you victory in battle. Mitsuhide held the poetry session under the guise of praying for victory against the Mori in the west, but it's clear that he actually meant it to pray for victory against Nobunaga. This bold declaration of war is proof that Mitsuhide had something big in mind. In most tales of revenge, there is no endgame. The Avenger has had some sort of injustice inflicted upon them, so they feel obligated to make the inflictor suffer. Nothing more, nothing less. For example, if we look at Brutus and his gang, when they assassinated Julius Caesar, they did so because they felt that he was in breach of the law and someone needed to put him in his place. After having killed Caesar, they didn't know how to react. They had nothing planned after killing him. To give a more Japanese example, the story of the 47 Ronin is quite famous. So the master of the 47 samurai drew his sword in court and assaulted a noble. He was punished for his crimes and killed. The 47 samurai under his belt, now Ronin as they were masterless, decided to seek revenge. After exacting revenge against the noble that had his master killed, they all committed seppuku. Once again in this case, there was nothing planned after the revenge other than to make the inflictor of supposed injustice suffer. When Mitsuhide held Nobunaga at gunpoint, the idea of revenge never once crossed his mind. He was far more interested in taking power for himself. After Mitsuhide killed Nobunaga, he immediately sent forces to kill Nobunaga's eldest son, and hence his legal successor, Oda Nobunaga. This gave some sort of validity to Mitsuhide's self-proclamation of shogun, as there technically wasn't a legal successor to inherit Nobunaga's legacy. The imperial court nervously sent Mitsuhide letters bestowing honours upon him, giving some sort of cloak of legitimacy to his power. And Mitsuhide was also quick to loot Nobunaga's castle and bribe his men, securing their loyalty. It is clear that Mitsuhide's intentions was to forcefully take Nobunaga's power and inherit his legacy. The timing of Mitsuhide's attack was also impeccable. If we think back, Nobunaga had just cleaned up his biggest foes, the Takeda clan and the warrior monks. The only other remaining threat was the Mori clan in the west. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was off fighting the Mori and was too busy with his own affairs to challenge Mitsuhide's power. It was a similar deal with Tokugawa Ieyasu, the only other man with an army behind him. He was off having a holiday in Osaka and didn't have any forces to tackle Mitsuhide with. And if we remember back, Mitsuhide had just secured an unofficial peace deal with the Chosokabe clan through his vassal, meaning that he had allies in this game. The amount of thought that went into the attack was far too complex for a simple revenge plot. It's clear that he was aiming for much more. It would have all gone according to plan if it weren't for Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who managed to wrap up his war against the Mori mere days after Nobunaga's assassination, freeing him from his obligations, allowing him to march on Mitsuhide. This leads us to our final question. Why did Mitsuhide want power? Living in 16th century Japan wasn't exactly amazing. The people were often subjected to draconian laws and oppressive taxes. If someone wanted to turn their rags into riches, all they had to do was kill someone in power and inherit their fortune. In the 16th century, there were numerous peasant groups that rose up to quell their overlords and instate their own power. These new peasant overlords enacted policies that benefited themselves and the lower classes. It can be imagined that a similar thing went through Mitsuhide's mind. He likely wanted to become the law and put into practice his ideal state. He also likely wanted to swoop in and take the credit for unifying Japan, finish Nobunaga's job, and etch his name into history. As we can see, the idea of samurai loyalty was long dead. The so-called samurai code was never a reality. Instead, it's just an ideal imposed by historians so they can try to better understand the samurai mindset. But like all ideals, it does not necessarily reflect reality. For example, if we remember back to the beginning, Nobunaga had to kill his own family to get to where he was. In this way, it's not some crude breakage of tradition that Mitsuhide turned against his master. In fact, he wasn't the only one who tried. A quick glance over history reveals that many others tried to kill Nobunaga, albeit unsuccessfully. Mitsuhide just gets the credit because he was successful, but the reality is his actions are overstated. In the climate of the 16th century, it's not surprising that someone tried to take Nobunaga's power from under his feet. But, Mitsuhide was a warlord in his own right. He was his own person. He was not just a passive follower of Nobunaga. If he wasn't the one to have done it, it would have only been a matter of time until someone else did. I'll conclude by bringing us back to Mitsuhide's grave. I don't think my wild tale of Mitsuhide's ambition is enough to quell his anger. But maybe, just maybe, I've lessened his anger, allowing a little bit of the crack to dissipate. Thank you. Andrew out.